December 13, 1943. Above the dense jungles of Assam, India, the sky is about to erupt. Second Lieutenant Philip Adair of the 89th Fighter Squadron is alone, the sole American pilot airborne in his P-40N Warhawk, affectionately named Lulu Bell. Suddenly, his radio crackles with an alert that chills him to the bone. 64 enemy aircraft are on the horizon, a massive Japanese formation screaming towards his home base at Dinjan Airfield. 24 heavily armed Ki-21 Sally bombers, shielded by a swarm of 40 nimble Ki-43 Oscar fighters. They are a flying fortress, and Philip Adair is the only thing standing in their way. What would you do? The odds aren't just stacked against him, they're astronomical. 64 against 1. The logical choice is to run, to save yourself and your plane. But Adair isn't thinking about logic. He's thinking about his friends, his comrades on the ground, completely vulnerable to the impending storm of bombs. Without a second thought, he pushes the throttle forward and points the nose of Lulu Bell directly at the enemy. He's not just going to fight, he's going on the attack. Adair dives headfirst into the formation, his 6.50 caliber machine guns blazing. He weaves through the wall of enemy fighters, aiming for the bombers the real threat to his base. He gets a Sally in his sights, unleashes a torrent of fire, and watches as it begins to trail smoke, breaking away from the formation. One down, but his moment of triumph is short-lived. The Oscar fighters, like angry hornets, are all over him. The air around his cockpit fills with the terrifying sound of impacting. Rounds, thump, thump, 16 hits tear through Lulu Bell's metal skin. The plane shudders violently. Adair feels a sickening lurch as the controls go slack in his hands. A look at his wings confirms his worst fear. The control cables to his right aileron are severed. The aileron itself is jammed, stuck in the up position. Immediately, the P-40's nose pitches down, and Lulu Bell spirals into an uncontrollable dive. He's plummeting from 2,000 feet, the ground rushing up to meet him. Every training manual, every instructor's voice from his days at Luke Field, screams one single undeniable command: bail out. They drilled it into him over and over. Flying a plane with damaged controls isn't brave, it's suicide. But as the wind shrieks past his canopy and the earth gets closer with each passing second, Philip Adair remembers something else. A lesson not from the official flight manual, but from the fundamental principles of aerodynamics. A desperate, almost insane idea begins to form in his mind. An idea that defied all his training, but it was the only chance he had. He refused to abandon his ship, refused to let his base be destroyed. What he did next would not only save his own life, but would leave every pilot who heard the story absolutely speechless. So, how does a pilot fly a plane with no controls? How do you turn a death dive into a weapon? The answer lies in a brilliant and daring application of flight physics under the most extreme pressure imaginable. This isn't just a story about courage. It's about a pilot who outsmarted his own damaged aircraft to continue the fight. Stay with us as we uncover the incredible solution that Philip Adair used to turn the tables on an entire enemy air armada. The date is December 13, 1943. Over the skies of Assam, India, Second Lieutenant Philip Adair of the 89th Fighter Squadron finds himself in an unimaginable nightmare. He is the only American pilot in the air as a massive wave of 64 Japanese aircraft appears on the horizon. 24 Ki-21 Sally bombers, escorted by 40 formidable Ki-43 Oscar fighters, are making a beeline for his home base, Dinjan Airfield. Outnumbered 64-1, Adair doesn't hesitate. He dives his P-40N Warhawk, affectionately nicknamed Lulu Bell, straight into the heart of the enemy formation. The air erupts in a storm of machine gun fire. Adair attacks with everything he has, but the sheer volume of enemy planes is overwhelming. Lulu Bell shudders violently as enemy rounds tear through its fuselage. 16 hits. The cockpit fills with the smell of hydraulic fluid and cordite. Suddenly, the controls go limp. His control cables are severed. The right aileron is jammed solid. The P-40's nose pitches down, sending Adair into an uncontrollable dive. He's plummeting from 2,000 feet, the ground rushing up to meet him. Every pilot's training manual screamed one clear instruction for this situation: bail out. His instructors back at Luke Field had been adamant. Attempting to fly a plane with damaged controls was not just risky. They called it suicide. The standard procedure was to jettison the canopy and jump, trusting your parachute to save your life. For any other pilot, this would have been the end of the story. But Philip Adair was not just any other pilot. As the Earth spun wildly in his windscreen, a different kind of training took over. It wasn't the rote memorization of emergency procedures, but a deep, intuitive understanding of aerodynamics forged in the crucible of combat. He recalled the fundamental principles of flight lift, weight, thrust, and drag. His primary controls were gone, but the aircraft still had its secondary control surfaces, the trim tabs. These small, adjustable tabs on the trailing edges of the rudder, elevators, and ailerons were designed for fine-tuning the plane's attitude to relieve pressure on the controls during long flights. Could they be used to actually fly the plane? It was a crazy, desperate idea. Using the trim wheels was a slow, clumsy process, never intended for radical maneuvers. But it was his only chance. Ignoring the instinct to panic, Adair's hands flew to the trim controls. He started cranking the elevator trim wheel, fighting the immense aerodynamic forces that were pulling his plane into its death dive. The nose began to lift, slowly, agonizingly. He was fighting the plane, the damage, and gravity itself. He countered the roll from the jammed aileron by applying opposite rudder trim. It was like trying to steer a battleship with a canoe paddle, but it was working. He had arrested the dive. He was flying, sort of. The P-40 was now a bucking, unwieldy beast, barely responsive to his frantic adjustments. But he was alive, and more importantly, he was still in the fight. Below him, the Japanese formation was continuing its unopposed run on his base. Bailing out would have saved his life, but it would have doomed his friends on the ground. Adair made a choice. He turned his crippled Warhawk back towards the 64 enemy aircraft. The solo pilot, in a plane that by all rights should have been a smoking crater, was about to re-engage. What happened next was an act of pure, calculated audacity that would leave both his allies and his enemies completely speechless. It would become a legendary tale of how one pilot, armed with a deep knowledge of his machine and an unbreakable will, turned certain death into a stunning victory. Why would a World War II pilot refuse to bail out of his plane when the controls were shot to pieces? Why would he ignore every single training manual that screamed eject now, and instead try to fly a broken machine? This isn't just a story about bravery. It's a story about a pilot who used his deep understanding of aerodynamics under extreme combat stress to achieve the impossible and save his entire base. The date is December 13, 1943. Over the skies of Assam, India, a massive aerial armada appears on the horizon. 64 Japanese aircraft, 24 Ki-21 Sally bombers, heavily armed and ready to unload their deadly cargo, escorted by a swarm of 40 agile Ki-43 Oscar fighters. Their target, the vital Allied airfield at Dingen. At that precise moment, only one Allied fighter is in the air. 2nd Lieutenant Philip Adair of the 89th Fighter Squadron. He's alone, flying his P-40N Warhawk, which he affectionately named Lulu Bell. Against odds that were not just long but astronomical, Adair didn't hesitate. He pushed his throttle forward and charged headfirst into the enemy formation. The sky erupted into a chaotic ballet of machine gun fire. Adair weaved through the escorting fighters, guns blazing, trying to break through to the bombers. But he was just one plane against 40 fighters. The inevitable happened. Enemy rounds tore through Lulu Bell's metal skin. 16 hits. Critical systems failed. Control cables snapped. His right aileron, essential for turning and stabilizing the aircraft, jammed completely. Suddenly, the nose of his P-40 pitched violently downwards. Adair was trapped in an uncontrollable, terrifying dive. His altimeter was spinning backwards, fast. He was plummeting from 2,000 feet. Every ounce of his training, every lesson drilled into him by his instructors back at Luke Field in Arizona, screamed one thing: bail out. They had a grim word for trying to fly a plane with broken controls. They called it suicide. The standard procedure was clear, absolute, and designed to save a pilot's life. If the controls are gone, you get out. Period. But as the ground rushed up to meet him, Philip Adair did something that left everyone who later heard his story completely speechless. He didn't reach for his parachute harness. He didn't prepare to abandon his crippled Warhawk. Instead, he stayed in his cockpit, his mind racing, trying to solve an impossible aerodynamic puzzle. With his life and the fate of his base hanging in the balance, he was about to attempt a maneuver so unconventional, so dangerous, that no one had ever trained for it because no one thought it was possible. So, how do you fly a plane with no controls? How do you pull out of a death dive when the stick in your hand is useless? Adair knew that his ailerons, elevators, and rudder were connected to the pilot's stick and pedals by a system of pulleys and long steel cables. Those cables had been shredded by enemy fire. Pushing the stick and kicking the pedals did absolutely nothing. His P-40 was now just a very heavy, very fast piece of falling metal. But Adair remembered a fundamental principle of flight, something buried deep in his pilot training that went beyond the standard emergency procedures. He knew that a plane's flight characteristics could be influenced by more than just the control surfaces. Things like engine power, speed, and weight distribution also played a crucial role. Specifically, he remembered something called P-factor and torque. When you slam the throttle forward on a powerful propeller plane like the P-40, the engine's immense torque tries to roll the aircraft in the opposite direction of the propeller's spin. Pilots constantly make tiny corrections for this with their ailerons and rudder without even thinking about it, but Adair's ailerons were broken. What if he could use that raw engine torque, not as a problem to be corrected, but as a tool, a substitute for his shattered controls? It was an insane idea, a desperate, last-ditch gamble. With the ground just seconds away, Adair fire-walled the throttle. He pushed the engine to its absolute maximum power. The massive Merlin engine roared to life, and the huge propeller bit into the air. The plane shuddered violently. Just as he hoped, the immense torque from the engine began to roll the aircraft. It was a crude, clumsy movement, but it was movement. He was no longer just a passenger on a falling projectile. By manipulating the throttle, revving the engine up and down, he could induce a slight roll. But rolling wasn't enough. He was still pointed straight at the ground. He needed to get the nose up. This is where another piece of aerodynamic genius came into play. Adair realized that if he could get the plane into a sideways slip, he could use the side of the fuselage itself as a sort of makeshift wing or rudder. By skillfully combining the engine torque to roll and a side slip to create drag and change direction, he might, just might, be able to wrestle Lulu Bell out of its death dive. He began a frantic, delicate dance with the throttle, gunning the engine, then backing off, trying to coax the wounded bird into a stable attitude. Slowly, miraculously, it started to work. The rate of descent slowed. The nose, which had been aimed at the Indian jungle like a spear, began to creep back towards the horizon. He wasn't flying gracefully. He was skidding through the sky, lurching and bucking like an untamed horse. But he was flying. He had pulled out of the dive. Philip Adair had just used his engine's throttle as a primary flight control and saved his own life. But his personal victory was short-lived. He looked up and his heart sank. The battle wasn't over. The sky was still thick with Japanese planes, and they were continuing their run on the Dingen airfield. Adair, now flying a plane that responded only to the whims of its engine throttle, made another unbelievable decision. He wasn't going to run. He was going back into the fight. He knew the enemy formation had been disrupted by his initial suicidal attack. They were likely confused, maybe even thinking there were more fighters defending the base. He had to capitalize on that confusion. Flying an almost uncontrollable aircraft, he turned back towards a swarm of bombers and fighters. Imagine what the Japanese pilots must have thought. This lone American fighter, which they had seen take multiple hits and fall out of the sky in what looked like a fatal dive, was now coming back at them. It was flying erratically, wobbling and skidding through the air, but it was still coming. Adair couldn't aim properly. He couldn't execute precise combat maneuvers. All he could do was point his wounded Warhawk in the general direction of the enemy and hope to be a disruptive force. He made pass after pass, a phantom hornet that refused to die, his very presence a psychological weapon. His wild, unpredictable flying might have convinced the Japanese flight leader that he was facing a crazy, unpredictable pilot, or perhaps that more Allied fighters were on their way. The Japanese formation, which had been so orderly just minutes before, began to break apart. The bombers, now nervous without their tight fighter screen and harassed by the single, seemingly invincible P-40, aborted their bombing run. They turned for home, their mission a failure. The escorting Oscar fighters, after a few more half-hearted passes at the bizarrely flying Lulu Bell, also disengaged and followed the bombers. Against 64 enemy aircraft, Second Lieutenant Philip Adair had single-handedly defended Dingen Airfield. And he did it in a plane that, by all rights, shouldn't have even been in the air. He had saved the base, the ground crew, and all the parked aircraft that would have been destroyed. But now he faced his final challenge: landing. How do you land a plane that you can't steer? He couldn't make a normal, gentle approach. He couldn't line up with the runway. He was still essentially wrestling the aircraft through the sky using only engine power. Adair knew a straightened landing was impossible. He had to burn off speed, but cutting the throttle too much would make him lose control completely. He flew a wide, clumsy circuit around the airfield, using his throttle jockeying technique to guide the plane roughly where he wanted it to go. The ground crew watched in stunned silence, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. They knew his plane was hit, but they couldn't imagine the extent of the damage. They just saw a P-40 flying in a way no P-40 was ever meant to fly. For his final approach, Adair had to time everything perfectly. He aimed for the start of the runway, cut the power at the last possible second, and let the plane fall the last few feet. It wasn't a landing. It was a controlled crash. Lulu Bell slammed onto the runway, bounced hard, and skidded for a dangerously long time before finally scraping to a halt. The silence that followed was deafening. Then the airfield erupted in cheers. Philip Adair was safe. The base was safe. When the maintenance crews finally got to his P-40, they were speechless. The control cables to the ailerons and elevators were not just damaged. They were completely severed, hanging uselessly in the fuselage. The right aileron was jammed solid. No one could understand how he had managed to fly it, let alone fight in it. Philip Adair's story became a legend, a testament to the idea that in the most desperate moments, true understanding and innovation can triumph over impossible odds. December 13, 1943. High above the lush jungles of Assam, India, the sky buzzed with a deadly swarm. 64 Japanese aircraft, a formidable force, were making a beeline for the Allied airbase at Dingen. 24 Ki-21 Sally bombers, heavy with destructive potential, were flanked by 40 nimble Ki-43 Oscar fighters. Their mission was clear: cripple the Allied air power in the region. But standing in their way was a lone sentinel, a single American pilot who happened to be in the wrong place at the right time. Second Lieutenant Philip Adair of the 89th Fighter Squadron was the only pilot airborne. He was just finishing a routine test flight in his P-40N Warhawk, affectionately named Lulu Bell. Suddenly, his radio crackled to life with an urgent warning from the ground controller. Bandits. Many, many bandits inbound. Adair looked up and saw the terrifying spectacle. A massive formation of enemy planes, a dark cloud against the blue canvas of the sky, was heading straight for his home base. He was outnumbered 64-1. For most pilots, the choice would be obvious: turn tail and run. Live to fight another day. Engaging such an overwhelming force alone was not just brave, it was suicidal. But Philip Adair wasn't most pilots. He knew that if he ran Dingaan Airfield and everyone on it would be defenseless. Without hesitation, he pushed his throttle forward and pointed the nose of Lulu Bell directly at the enemy. He was going on the attack. Adair ripped into the formation with a fury that belied his lone status. His 6.50 caliber machine guns roared, spitting fire at the Japanese bombers. He weaved through the escorting fighters, a lone wolf among a pack of predators. The sky became a chaotic ballet of tracer fire and twisting aircraft. Adair managed to score hits on one of the Sally bombers, watching as smoke began to trail from its engine. He had drawn first blood, but his audacious attack did not go unanswered. The Oscar fighters swarmed him, their guns blazing. Lulu Bell shuddered as bullets tore through her metal skin. 16 hits, one after another, hammered into the P-40, the cockpit filled with the sharp smell of cordite and hydraulic fluid. Warning lights flashed across his instrument panel. Then, a devastating blow. A shell severed his control cables. The stick went limp in his hand. Another hit jammed his right aileron completely. Lulu Bell was mortally wounded. The aircraft's nose pitched down violently, and Adair found himself locked in an uncontrollable terminal dive. He was plummeting from 2,000 feet, the ground rushing up to meet him. Every fiber of his training, every lesson drummed into him by his instructors back at Luke Field in Arizona, screamed one word: bail out. The manual was clear. Damaged flight controls were a death sentence. Attempting to fly a plane in this condition was, as they said, suicide. The parachute was his only hope. As his hand reached for the canopy release, something stopped him. Peering through the plexiglass, he could see the Dingaan Airfield below, still unaware of the impending doom. He saw the barracks, the hangars, the men on the ground. If he bailed out now, his crippled P-40 would crash, and that massive wave of 64 Japanese planes would continue on, unopposed, to unleash hell upon the base. He couldn't let that happen. He had to do something. But what could he do? He was in a diving, uncontrollable plane with no ailerons. He was a sitting duck. That's when a radical, almost insane idea sparked in his mind. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble born from a deep understanding of aerodynamics and a refusal to give up. He remembered lessons from flight school, not about bailing out, but about the fundamental forces that keep a plane in the air: lift, weight, thrust, and drag. His primary flight controls were gone, but he still had secondary controls. He still had his throttle and his rudder. Could it be possible? Could he use the engine's power and the rudder to steer the plane? It defied all conventional wisdom. It was a theory that existed only in textbooks, not in the heart of a life-or-death dogfight. With the ground screaming towards him, Adair made his choice. He wasn't going to jump. He was going to fly. He slammed the throttle to full power. The surge of the engine created a powerful torque, a twisting force that wanted to roll the aircraft. Normally, a pilot would correct this with the ailerons, but Adair's were useless. Instead, he stomped on the rudder pedal. By carefully balancing the engine's torque against the yaw created by the rudder, he began to wrestle for control. Slowly, miraculously, the steep dive began to shallow. He was using the engine and rudder to literally muscle the plane through the air, forcing it to turn and climb. It was like trying to steer a car with only the gas pedal. The P-40 responded sluggishly, fighting him every inch of the way. but it was responding. He had pulled out of the dive. He was flying. He had done the impossible. But saving himself was only the first step. The Japanese formation was still on its way to the airfield. Adair, flying his battered and barely controllable plane, turned back towards the fight. He couldn't maneuver for a proper attack, but he could still be a threat. He could still be a distraction. He charged back towards the enemy formation, his presence alone causing confusion and chaos among the Japanese pilots. They saw a plane that should have been a smoking wreck on the ground, still in the air, still coming at them. The ground controllers at Denjon, who had watched Adair's P-40 plummet, were stunned to see it level out. They had been preparing for the worst, but now they were witnessing a miracle. They radioed Adair, their voices a mix of disbelief and awe, asking about his status. Adair's reply was calm and steady. "Controls are shot to hell. But I think I can still steer her." He continued to harass the Japanese formation, making it impossible for the bombers to line up for a clean bombing run on the airfield. His unpredictable, wobbly flight path made him a difficult target to hit, and his sheer audacity kept the escorting fighters occupied. They couldn't ignore this lone, resurrected P-40 that refused to die. Every minute he kept them busy was another minute for the ground defenses to prepare and for other Allied fighters to scramble. The Japanese commander, likely bewildered by the ferocity and resilience of this single American pilot, hesitated. The attack was losing its coordination. The element of surprise was gone. Facing such unexpectedly stiff resistance from what they thought was an undefended target, and with their fuel running low for the long trip back to their base in Burma, the commander made a startling decision. He called off the attack. The entire formation of 64 bombers and fighters turned around and headed for home, leaving Dinjan Airfield completely untouched. Alone in the sky, Philip Adair had single-handedly repelled a major air raid. But his ordeal wasn't over. He still had to land a plane with no aileron control. Landing is one of the most delicate phases of flight, requiring precise control. Doing it with only throttle and rudder was unheard of. He radioed the tower. "I'm coming in, but this is going to be tricky. Clear the field." The entire base held its breath. Everyone stopped what they were doing to watch. Fire trucks and ambulances raced to the edge of the runway. Adair lined up for his approach, wrestling with the throttle and rudder, his hands and feet working in a desperate, improvised dance. The P-40 wobbled precariously, its wings rocking back and forth. It touched down hard, bounced once, then settled onto the runway, skidding to a halt. The silence was broken by a collective cheer that erupted across the airfield. When the ground crew pulled him from the cockpit of the bullet-riddled Lulu Bell, they were speechless. They saw the severed cables and the jammed aileron. They couldn't believe he had not only survived, but had flown, fought, and landed the plane. Second Lieutenant Philip Adair. As quick thinking and mastery of flight theory under extreme pressure had turned a suicidal situation into one of the most incredible solo victories of World War II. For his actions that day, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, a testament to a pilot who, when faced with impossible odds, chose to rewrite the rulebook and saved his base from annihilation. His story reminds us that sometimes the greatest weapon in combat isn't firepower, but a calm mind and an unbreakable will to survive. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this incredible story of bravery and ingenuity, be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing tales from history. We'll see you in the next one.